Congressman Mike Lawler has been one of the most steadfast supporters of the Jewish community and one of the biggest champions fighting anti-Semitism in Congress over the last couple of years. Congressman Lawler is the author and the main champion of the Antisemitism Awareness Act, a pivotal piece of bipartisan legislation that would require the U.S. Department of Education to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which includes a whole host of anti-Semitic types of anti-Zionism and criticism of Israel under the umbrella of anti-Semitism, which would be crucial for people all across the country, and especially people on college campuses, to help push back against the pervasive and ubiquitous anti-Semitism that we have felt over the past 2 years. Today on the podcast, I was lucky enough to be in conversation with the congressman. We talked about campus and how campus has allowed anti-Semitism to foster and foment over the past couple of years. We spoke about Israel and the recent treaty that Trump helped broker between Israel and Gaza. We talked about anti-Semitism on the left. We talked about anti-Semitism on the right, and much, much more. The Jewish community is truly lucky to have people in Congress like Mike Lawler, and it was a pleasure to talk to him. Also on the podcast is my friend and activist Adam Fox, who was the reason why Mike Lawler came onto the podcast today, as Adam has been tirelessly connecting with members of Congress, helping raise awareness for the Antisemitism Awareness Act, which is one of the things that we spoke about on the podcast today. Before we get into the podcast today, I hope you like and subscribe. And now I bring you Congressman Mike Lawler. Congressman, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start off with just, generally talking about anti-Semitism and the role that you've been doing in Congress to combat it. Why has this been such a major part of your tenure in Congress?
Well, I think obviously in the aftermath of October 7th, we saw a rise in anti-Semitism, not just on college campuses, but around the globe and in cities across the United States. But to me, this is not something new. It's been happening for years. It's been happening in our education system for years, and it has permeated the atmosphere. And so to me, this was something I was working on before October 7th, especially holding our institutions of higher learning accountable. And I had introduced the Stop Anti-Semitism on College Campuses Act, which would strip any institution of higher learning of federal dollars, including student aid, if they promote or sanction anti-Semitism on their campus, which so many of them were allowing to happen. Both in terms of the curriculum, but also in terms of the students, the protests, the conduct. You look at, the CUNY law school graduation speech in May of 2023. I graduated as valedictorian in my class. I spoke at my college graduation. I know what goes into it. They don't just let you walk out on stage. Your remarks are reviewed for good reason. And so from my vantage point, it was clear that they were allowing it to happen under the guise of, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But as I've long believed, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And so, from my perspective, legislatively, my objective was not to infringe upon free speech, but to hold these institutions accountable for what is permitted on their campus, and especially with the use of federal dollars, and to enforce civil rights law and uphold Title VI. And so that's why we introduced the Antisemitism Awareness Act, to really hold these institutions accountable, to better define what anti-Semitism is. And we made great progress last Congress, getting it through the House. Unfortunately, Chuck Schumer sat on it, refused to bring it to the floor for a vote. And it created a real challenge in getting the legislation passed, especially at the height of these protests and, the focus on the issue of anti-Semitism. It was really a missed opportunity by Chuck Schumer, who calls himself Shomer, defender of the Jewish people, but really he's a shanda. He's a disgrace, and what he allowed to happen to the Jewish people on these college campuses.
So I want to get back to, the questions of free speech in a little bit, maybe in like 10 or 15 minutes, because I have some questions about that. I do want to focus, a little bit about, why you think this problem was allowed to happen. So you mentioned Chuck Schumer, and I know that Adam has a question about, bipartisan, because obviously, one, in order to fight anti-Semitism, we obviously need both sides on board. Also, to protect Israel, we need both the right and left. Too. I'll throw it to Adam for a question about this, but I really want to dig into this idea of the Democrats really having a couple years to do something and not doing anything.
Congressman Lawler, thank you so much for everything you've done for the Jewish community, not only in your district, for all Jewish Americans. Your
Appreciate it.
leadership has been amazing. So, what I'd like to ask you about is for the Antisemitism Awareness Act. What was it like trying to engage both sides of the aisle? In this era just of divisive politics, trying to get co-sponsorships from equal members from both sides is incredibly difficult, but you managed to get a great number of Republicans on your side, a great number of Democrats on the other side to jump on board with that. Can you describe to us kind of how it was like to engage with, especially maybe even the other side, and finding partners in creating this amazing bipartisan legislation?
Well, I have a very good relationship with one of my colleagues across the aisle, Josh Gottheimer, a Democrat from New Jersey. Our districts border New York and New Jersey. And so, we have very similar constituencies in a lot of ways and a lot in common. But we worked together on this and really, put the pressure on leadership, on our colleagues, and in the press to advance this legislation and to garner broad bipartisan support. We worked with a number of Jewish organizations throughout the country to amp up the pressure and really push to get this done. And so it was very frustrating when it languished in the Senate, because Chuck Schumer had told all of these organizations, don't worry, after the election, I'll put it on the floor for a vote. And he lied. He lied and refused to do so and played a lot of games. He was petrified of upsetting Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and that wing of the Democratic Party, with respect to this bill in particular. And so it undermined the effort to really hold these institutions accountable, which is why, President Trump's election is so critical, because he's the one who put the executive order in place on Title VI and on adopting the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism for the Department of Education. So this is, this was going to codify that, but President Trump came back and he has enforced it, and he has held these institutions accountable. And the Department of Education has gone after institutions like Harvard, which allowed anti-Semitism to permeate their campus for years. And so, I think a big part of this is trying to enshrine it into law. But the administration has taken a lot of concrete steps to hold these institutions accountable. And that's obviously a big positive step in the right direction.
For listeners who aren't as in the weeds of how exactly all this works behind the scenes, as of course you are, can you explain, obviously Harvard is a private school, the CUNY system is a public school, here I'm in California, we have the UC system and the CSU system. What is the dynamic between, let's say this passes, which hopefully it will, what exactly happens next in terms of if both a private or public school that obviously both receives federal money, if they have professors that make statements, or if they allow, some future iteration of the encampment to fester, is that grounds for suing them? Is that grounds for taking away money? Like, what are exactly the teeth that come at the end of this? Because I want to eventually ask you about, some people's free speech concerns. I looked into it and it was sort of hard to understand the argument that the free speech people were making, but I would love to ask you about, what are the actual teeth of this bill? What happens to a Harvard and a UC Irvine if they continue to allow anti-Semitism?
Well, so the objective is to get the Department of Education to ensure that Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which protects against discrimination on college campuses, that these institutions are being held to account and upholding federal law and civil rights law to ensure that no person is discriminated against. And when you see, obviously, over years, we've had incidents of racism, of bigotry, of hatred, and these institutions have rightly come down on it. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, they seemingly have no interest. And in fact, not only have no interest in upholding Title VI, they actively work to undermine it and promote anti-Semitism on their campuses. And so the objective here is to get the Department of Education to enforce Title VI, to uphold federal law, to hold them accountable. And ultimately, if it means clawing back federal dollars, if it means going after their charters, if it means going after their funding sources, or taxing them at a higher rate in the endowment, these are steps that the federal government can take to ensure accountability and to force change, to force them to comply with federal law. And that's really the goal. It is not preventing people from their First Amendment and their free speech rights. They're entitled to say ultimately what they want, but we don't have to pay for it. And, when federal tax dollars are being used in furtherance of this nonsense, there needs to be accountability for it. So, whether you're talking about a private institution or a public one, the fact is federal law still applies.
Yeah, no, this is a crucial distinction that I just want to point out for listeners, that I can come up with a business and I can say or do whatever I want. That's different than the taxpayer money actually funding it. I think that's sort of obvious. What I was surprised to see, so it was not a surprise that all of the, far left institutions that don't really seem to care about anti-Semitism came out against this. I was surprised to see FIRE, which, is a very libertarian, First Amendment centric organization, came out against it. Can you sort of, and I took some time last week and I read through their opposition, and then I read other pieces that were talking about why their opposition doesn't make sense. But I mean, I guess taking a step back, what was sort of their main point? Because they seem to not really understand that distinction you just made.
Well, I think a lot of these institutions were zeroing in on the IHRA definition itself and the examples, and trying to say, if somebody harbors, a view, for instance, that the Jews killed Jesus, that that would be, violating their First Amendment rights and their religious freedom rights and their right to believe, what is in the Bible. Nobody is sitting in dispute of historical events within the Bible. What we are saying, though, is if you, for instance, say all Jews killed Jesus, if you're trying to cast aspersions or use longstanding anti-Semitic tropes to, label or, dehumanize people on college campuses, that is an example of anti-Semitism, and that the institution should use that as an example when determining whether or not, anti-Semitism has occurred on their campus, and whether or not there needs to be accountability for the individuals involved. That's just one example, and we know throughout history that example in particular has been used repeatedly to go after Jews. And so it is something that, I think the idea that people would try to say, well, that's just not anti-Semitic. It is. If you are claiming that all Jews killed Jesus, yeah, that is an example of anti-Semitism. And anti-Zionism, being against the Jewish state. You have multiple Arab states. None of these people seem to be against the Arab states that are in the region and surround Israel. They just seemingly are against a Jewish state. Why? What is their objection? And so it raises questions. Does it mean every instance of a discussion or comment rises to the level of anti-Semitism? No. But it is instructive to try and ensure that these institutions are upholding federal law. That is the purpose of the bill.
So just to be clear, a student at both a private and public school can still say whatever they want, right? They can raise their hand in class and say Israel is a genocidal colonialist, or the Jews killed Jesus. That's fine. It's just if the school
they can say it, but that doesn't mean that there's not going to be consequences for it, as there are with anything people say. I mean, we just saw in a situation where young Republicans were espousing anti-Semitic and racist viewpoints in a private group chat that became public. They've lost their jobs as a result.
Sure, but
There's
that wasn't
always
against the law
consequences.
necessarily, right?
No,
Like
no,
that's
no, no.
yeah.
It's not against the law, but there are consequences to actions. And what we're saying is these institutions have a responsibility to uphold federal law. They have a responsibility to protect the civil rights of all students on campus. They have a responsibility to ensure the safety and well-being of all students on campus. And if somebody is engaged in conduct that violates federal law, these institutions have a responsibility to ensure there is accountability. That is the objective of the bill.
Both Rabbi and I were on-campus Hillel professionals on and after October 7th. And on my campus, the rapid rise, instant. It was my Jewish students coming to me the day after, already saying that they were taunted, that they were afraid to say that they were Jewish. And then we also saw the efforts to go to the administration and try to make the case that there is this increased level. And the most we got, I mean, at least from my experience, was the whataboutisms. And we'll look into it, and it just went out the other ear. But my question to you is that in that early stages, when you were first really learning about and doing the research and speaking to students and speaking to those who were victims, how did you feel personally about this unacceptable rise in anti-Semitism as a result of Hamas's attack and massacre in Israel? And what finally clicked and said, I got to do something about this. Let's put a legislation like the Antisemitism Awareness Act onto the table.
Well, first of all, it's outrageous what was happening and what continues to happen in some instances, less frequent, but still happening. But it was outrageous. And, I think from a standpoint as a human being, all of us can look and say nobody should be mistreated simply because of who they are. They shouldn't be mistreated simply because of their faith and or their point of view. And so the question is, how do you deal with that? And, I felt that there needed to be greater enforcement of existing federal law and that we needed to hold these institutions accountable. But moreover, to me, the level of ignorance that these children were espousing and the stupidity in which they were, engaged in this conduct was terrible. And I was proud to go stand on the steps at Columbia University during the height of these protests and call them out to their face for exactly what they were, an abomination to our country. And, to basically call on the president of Columbia University at the time to resign. She had lost all control. She had failed to do her job and to ensure the safety and well-being of these students and really allowed this level of hatred and ignorance to permeate an institution of higher learning. And so to me, it required not just a legislative, fix, but also speaking out. And that's why I couldn't believe that Jerry Nadler, the representative of Columbia University, and Chuck Schumer, the representative of Columbia, never went there and called out these kids and demanded that they stop. No, in fact, Chuck Schumer sent a private email to the leadership of Columbia saying, don't worry, this will pass. It's just a Republican ploy. I mean, it was just insane to see the response by some of my colleagues and that, they were doing nothing to stop this. And so to me, it really required moral clarity. It required a public pushback in addition to obviously a legislative one, and also to really look to hold these institutions and students accountable, including revoking visas of those who were here that, really had no business being here given their conduct and given what they were engaged in. And so, There's a lot that goes into this when you're trying to change behavior and make a difference. But those are the things I was thinking about during all this.
I've spoken a lot on the podcast about how October 7th sort of switched my political disposition. Exactly what you just said. I was watching the lack of federal reaction from Democrats, and then it seemed like Republicans were the ones that truly wanted to champion at least the cause of fighting anti-Semitism on campus. I would imagine, somebody like Jerry Nadler or Chuck Schumer, there's sort of this cognitive dissonance between what they really believe and what they're doing. You mentioned before they're probably afraid of being primaried from the left. What have some of those private conversations been with Democrats? You obviously don't need to give names, but I would imagine you get a lot of Democrats pulling you aside privately and say, hey, it's insane what's happening on campus. We agree with you, but for variety of reasons of, donors or social media, we can't go along. Is that true? Or do you really get the sense that Democrats don't truly understand this to be a problem in terms of what's been happening on campus?
Look, there was definitely a moment when a lot of Democrats were realizing this was a big problem. But look at where we are today. And so many of them have turned their backs on Israel. They've gone with the wind. They've joined the Free Palestine resistance. And yet, meanwhile, Hamas yesterday executing Palestinians in broad daylight, after Israeli forces pulled back. And where are these people now? They have nothing to say. They're not speaking out against the hatred and the violence and the vitriol. And so what it leads you to believe is that it's really all about Jews, and it's all about anti-Semitism, and it's all about just a vile hatred of the Jewish people. And so that's where, to me, I think so many of my Democratic colleagues have really lost their way on this because they're petrified of their base and petrified of primaries and unwilling to call it out. And you have, we're a few weeks away from an election, and you have an anti-Semite on the verge of becoming mayor of New York City, who literally just raised money for UNRWA, an organization, backed by the United Nations that Congress defunded because of its role in October 7th and because of the anti-Semitism they have taught in the schools in Gaza and the use of funds to support terrorism. And yet this candidate for mayor literally just did a fundraiser for UNRWA, and nobody said a word. And so it really speaks volumes to the problems that I think the Democratic Party is facing when it comes to this issue.
Well, I don't think it's as, especially when talking about campus, it's certainly not as front of mind, nor would I argue, nearly as, widespread or dangerous. But what do you make of the sort of rising anti-Semitism on the right? You had mentioned the sort of leaked group chat before for listeners that aren't, following the news as much as we probably all are. This was a bunch of young Republicans who were, making things like Hitler jokes and, gassing the Jews alongside other racist jokes. You obviously have, what many are calling the woke right, the Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens sort of wing of the Republican Party. How much influence do you think they have, on a broad level in the Republican world?
Well, number one, obviously, as I said, I spoke out and condemned those young Republicans immediately and called for their resignations from their positions, because there should be zero tolerance for that, regardless of whether it's anti-Semitism, racism, hatred, bigotry. It's just not something anyone should tolerate. You look at the kind of isolationist wing of the party that is taking a very critical posture towards Israel. I think it is a small but boisterous faction within the party. I think many of us have pushed back against it and spoken out against it, and will continue to.
And this is a clear difference. I just want to point out for listeners, a clear difference between the right and left, whereas Democrats don't seem to want to push back and condemn the anti-Semitism on their side, whereas, to your point, Republicans really have. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, and I will continue to wherever it rears its head. But I think the objective, on the part of some of those kind of within the isolationist wing, a lot of them are very much focused on ending America's involvement in conflicts around the globe. and they want U.S. dollars to be pulled. They don't want to spend as much on foreign aid. They don't want to spend as much in terms of sending our military into different areas. They don't want to use military force. That is a policy debate and difference to be had, and that's fine. It's when it borders into blaming the Jews or trying to accuse the Jews of being behind U.S. foreign policy. I mean, that's where it gets absurd, and can and should be called out every time.
Now moving forward, right? We unfortunately last Congress the bill did not get passed, and you explained why. And now we have its current version. It's got a lot of members who were from the last Congress to be co-sponsors. We got new members of Congress that have done it. So now where are we at right now with the act? I know there were supposed to be some hearings and it got postponed. So what does it look like timeline? And do you feel there's now a good sense of urgency now that we're at this pivotal point to say now is the chance to get it through the House, into the Senate, and into the president's office for signature, which I'm sure President Trump is going to sign it when it's in front of him.
Well, look, the bill obviously it codifies the existing executive order that is still in place. My objective is to get this passed. We're continuing to work with leadership. I think some of the concerns center around the specific examples and how those are written. And we're trying to work through some of the language to see if we can address some of these concerns to advance the bill, because I think at the end of the day, the objective here is not to police speech. The objective is to ensure accountability for these institutions of higher learning, that they uphold and enforce federal law. That's the objective of the bill, and to better define what anti-Semitism is for that purpose. And so, that's what we're continuing to work towards. And I'm not going to stop fighting until we get this done.
Well, we really appreciate it. We've been talking for a while, and we wanted to thank you for your time. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you wanted to just finish with, either in regards to the act or just, politics in general looking forward?
Just say, the peace agreement forged by President Trump was a historic and monumental step forward. There's a lot more work to do to ensure lasting peace and stability in the Middle East, but getting the 20 hostages returned home was pivotal. The president said he would do it, and he delivered on that, and he deserves all the praise in the world for doing so. We need to get the remaining deceased hostages home, including Americans Omir Nutra and Ite Chen. Their families deserve closure. They deserve to be able to give them a proper burial. So we'll keep working towards these solutions and continue to stand up for a strong U.S.-Israel relationship.
Well, Representative Mike Lawler, thank you so much.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, guys.